My uncle's not well, Mr. Carnby. I want to make sure he's all right.
And what's my part in this? You couldn't get a cab?
I just wouldn't feel safe going alone.
For as much grief as the 2008 reboot of Alone in the Dark got, I remember it fondly. It was a fun, creepy alternative to Resident Evil, especially as the series was shit in the bed at that time. Plus, you could set everything on fire, which is a win in my books. One terribly received PC release is all we've gotten in the meantime, and so when news of a fresh entry crossed our desks, I was quite intrigued, but also slightly guarded. I needn't have been though, as Alone in the Dark has come good, with some heavy thanks to Capcom's reboots of Resident Evil. Those thanks form the base of Alone in the Dark, from the perspective to the visual style, pacing, map screen, and even the way a spotlight shines on a key as we zoom in to watch open a door with no hands in sight. Pieces Interactive are clearly as big a fan of the Resident Evil remakes as I am, although this is no bad thing. If anything, I found it eased me into the game even more than the aforementioned 360 reboot. That's not to say it's all a homage though. Alone in the Dark forges its own path in presenting a more psychological story rather than out and out horror. We play as either the returning detective Edward Carnby, here played rather well by Stranger Things' David Harbour, or Emily Hartwood, played for my money better by Jodie Comer. Hartwood has hired Carnby to assist her in finding her uncle and bringing him home after he sent some worrying letters about the institute he was housed in. And yet another Resident Evil nod, as they arrive at the house we get to choose who we're going to play as. Each follows the basic same story, albeit with twists and alternate takes on scenes throughout. There's no real A-B scenario here, but it is nice to have the option to play through twice, as I have, and get more context for what's going on in the overall picture. And we'll need it, because Alone in the Dark goes places. Obviously we'll keep spoiler free here, but let's just say we're not confined to the mansion for the entire game. It's a bit dreamlike and bizarre, but engaging enough to keep me invested throughout both playthroughs. There are also Lagny apes to find. These hidden collectibles offer more lore and occasionally in-game bonuses, as well as alternate endings should we collect them all. When we're not being asked to question reality itself, Alone in the Dark follows the Resident Evil formula pretty closely. A sprawling, interconnected area that slowly unlocks as we gather new keys or meet new people, several puzzles to solve in order to get a MacGuffin to open the next area, and occasional bursts of combat. The atmosphere created here, be it the Institute or elsewhere, often crosses into creepy territory. Plenty of ambient noise, sudden crashes and bangs and groans, hints that shit's about to go down, and more help foster unease throughout. Even previously safer areas might suddenly verge into holy crap moments, as it was rare on my first playthrough that I wasn't walking instead of running, just in case. Puzzles offer up a mix of straightforward key goes here, and more involved affairs where we need to look for clues in our inventory or in other areas. Nothing was ever majorly head-scratching, but the helping hands felt just about right without walking us through it completely. One aspect in this regard I really appreciated is the map. When we start, we can choose from modern or classic modes of play. The former has a far more instructive map, while the latter leaves us to our own devices. Coming off of playing Elisa earlier this year and its strict adherence to days of old, it was welcome that Alone in the Dark would offer this choice. In modern mode, the map will highlight rooms we've explored, whether we've cleared them fully, as well as locations of puzzles, and, most helpfully, whether we can currently solve it with the items or knowledge that we have at hand. While I still enjoyed Elisa's way of things, there's no doubt this was a far smoother experience due to this aid, letting us keep on track even if we have to stop and start playing often, or simply have a bad memory these days. Puzzles and exploration are great then, but I must say I'm not as fond of the combat side of things. It's not bad really, it's also just not that exciting. We have access to, eventually, a trio of firearms, as well as breakable melee weapons and throwables we find scattered about, but the feel of the combat is just fine. Enemies, on the recommended difficulty at least, don't take too much punishment, but are fond of ducking out of the way and avoiding hits, especially some of the aerial enemies later on. Our protagonist can quick duck out of the way, but this proved hit and miss for me, either getting caught up on enemies anyway or moving in a way that the camera would be caught up on the scenery or other enemies and make it hard for us to see. The final boss here was the worst offender, as in such a tight space and there's so much going on, at times it was all I could do to avoid damage, let alone get my own attacks in. We can utilise stealth to avoid enemies at times, though again this is hit and miss. Sometimes the enemy would be staring me in the face, but because I was crouched they couldn't see me, whereas at others I was spotted before I could even start to approach an area. So while the action side of Alone in the Dark was slightly underwhelming, I can't say it made a massive knock on my experience overall. While I was exploring, solving puzzles and taking in the weird and wonderful goings on, the game had me hooked right in. So much so that over the few nights it took me to beat, I ended up staying up way later than I'd planned, just wanting to see what was next. I did find my time with Hartwood's side of the story more enjoyable. It felt to me that this was the main story that was told, as her relationship to her uncle and the others at the Institute definitely lent more weight to things, while Carnby's complete outsider perspective made some of the weirder moments feel a bit rushed. He was very keen to not talk about what had happened to him with Hartwood, whereas she was a bit more forthcoming. That's not to say her side of things didn't have its disjointed moments, but overall it felt a lot more coherent. Overall, I've had a decent time with Alone in the Dark. The Resident Evil reboots are a clear and massive inspiration, and while it might not be quite on their level, Alone in the Dark still manages to entertain with a weird and wonderful experience. The combat sections are definitely a weak spot, but the exploration and puzzle parts are able to balance this out very nicely indeed.